Hi, my name is Emily Hunsicker, and I'm going to be talking about the short and long reflexes of the enteric nervous system as a part of our assignment portfolio for the digestive system. So today I'm going to go over a few brief bullets in reference to the short and long reflexes of the enteric nervous system. First, we'll take a look at an overview of the enteric nervous system, then we'll look at the long versus short reflexes, and then we'll spend a brief moment at the end integrating these concepts into the digestive system as a whole. So, according to Silverthorne, the enteric nervous system was first recognized more than a century ago, and this occurred when scientists noted that isolated secretions of the intestine removed from the body still created a wave of peristaltic contraction when pressure in the lumen increased. And what they observed really was the ability of the ENS, or the enteric nervous system, to carry out a reflex independent of control by the central nervous system. So the enteric nervous system, or intrinsic nervous system, is one of the main divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, and it consists of a mesh-like system of neurons that govern the function of the gastrointestinal tract. And so in this slide, what you'll see is kind of a breakdown of how the enteric nervous system shares features and commonalities with the central nervous system. So first, there's intrinsic neurons in the ENS. So these are neurons that lie completely within the wall of the gut, much like an intraneuron would in the CNS. We also have neurotransmitters and neuromodulators in the ENS. The neurotransmitters in the ENS are sometimes called non-adrenergic and non-cholinergic to distinguish from more traditional neurotransmitters. And some examples of these would be serotonin, vasoactive intestinal peptide, and nitric oxide. Additionally, the enteric nervous system has glial support cells. So this is similar to the astroglia of the brain, rather than to the Schwann cells that we would see in the peripheral nervous system. So once again, reflecting its parallel with the CNS. The enteric nervous system has a diffusion barrier. So this is where the capillaries are not very permeable, which creates this barrier, and that's very similar to the blood-brain barrier that we find in the cerebral blood vessels. And then finally, the integrating center of the enteric nervous system, essentially the reflexes that originate in the GI tract can be integrated and acted on without any other neural signal leaving the ENS. And so for this reason, the ENS is considered its own integrating center. So as we look a little bit more into how the neuronal network of the enteric system works, we find that it's actually found within the submucosa and muscularis external, specifically between the longitudinal and circular muscle layers. So as you can see here, we've got the submucosa and the muscularis external, and you can see the submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus residing in between those two layers. And the nerves that control the smooth muscle effector tissue of the three layers of the gastrointestinal tract course through that submucosa and muscularis externa. And the effector tissues that are called into service by the ENS are constituted of the secretory glands that provide the chemical secretions for digestion, as well as the smooth muscle layers of the muscularis externa that provide the contractions responsible for both that mixing and propulsion movements of luminal contents that we see in segmentation and peristalsis. Now we're going to take a look at our long versus short reflexes. So first we'll talk about a long reflex. You can see that at the top of the slide. We've got the obviously the lumen of the digestive tract, peripheral ganglion, and then the sensory cell synapse in the spinal cord that's going to send it up to the brain. And so although the enteric nervous system can work in isolation, it also sends sensory information to the CNS and receives input from the CNS through the autonomic neurons. So a classic neural reflex will begin with that stimulus that's transmitted along a sensory neuron to the CNS, where then the stimulus is integrated and acted on. So in the digestive system, some classic reflexes originate with sensory receptors in the GI tract, but others originate outside the digestive system. So no matter where they originate, digestive reflexes that are integrated in the CNS are called long reflexes. So that's the main differentiating factor. They're integrated in the CNS. If we look at our short reflex right below on the same slide, we'll see that this enteric nerve plexus in the gut wall that we just looked at, it's going to act as a little brain. And that little brain allows for these local reflexes to begin, be integrated, and end all completely within the GI tract. So reflexes that originate within the enteric system and then are integrated there without any outside input are going to be called short reflexes. And like we talked about, the submucosal plexus contains these sensory neurons that receive the signals from the lumen of the gut. So the ENS network integrates the sensory information and then initiates the response. The submucosal plexus controls secretion by GI epithelial cells. And then the myenteric plexus neurons and the muscularis externa, influence the motility, like we previously discussed. So this is just a second slide that sort of highlights what we just talked about on the previous slide, the difference between the long reflexes and the short reflexes. Once again, the long reflex is integrated within the CNS, and it may originate in or outside of the GI tract. That it's irrelevant to whether or not it's a long reflex. And also a part of these long reflexes are feed forward or emotional reflexes that are integrated and initiated entirely outside the GI tract. So these are referred to as our cephalic reflexes. A good example of a feed forward response would be stimuli such as sight, smell, sound, thought. Maybe your mom's in the kitchen cooking a stir fry and you smell it from the room next door. So all of a sudden, that thought of food and then that smell triggers your body to prepare for digestion, or for the digestive tract to prepare for food. Your mouth starts to water and your stomach starts to growl. These are all feed-forward responses, and they're considered long reflexes. Another example of an emotional reflex would be that link between your brain and the GI tract. Maybe I would say most of us have experienced butterflies in the stomach that sometimes induce vomiting, diarrhea, that type of thing. That would be another example of one of those emotional reflexes taken care of by the long reflex. And then as you can see at the bottom, the short reflex, like we said, is integrated entirely in the enteric nervous system with no input from the CNS. It's initiated by changes in pH, distension, osmolarity, products of digestion. All of these things can initiate a short reflex. And the submucosal plexus is what contains those sensory neurons. And then the afferent info is sent to a ganglia, and efferent information is then sent to the submucosal and myenteric plexus, once again for control of the secretion, motility, and growth. So our last slide here is just a look at how it all works together and also separately. So as you can see, that external stimulus can come in, sight or smell, the sensory receptors then send it to the cephalic brain, which then, puts out a signal to the digestive tract, the smooth muscles or secretory cells. But the GI system can also act independently of that CNS, and we see that in that smaller yellowish box right here, where we have the local stimulus, like we said, could be pH, stretch, osmolarity, products of digestion. Then we get those sensory receptors and neurons, the interneurons, and the neurons of the myenteric and submucosal plexus, which then stimulate the smooth muscles and secretory cells. And this all happens without input from the CNS. So as you can see, our red arrows, these are all indicative of our short reflexes, And as you can see, our gray arrows indicate um, the long reflex and how that process works. Um, so thank you for sitting with me for almost 10 minutes here. I hope you learned something new, and we'll talk to you later.